Welcome to another episode of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. It's Left of Lansing with Pat Johnston. A progressive and populist insight into Michigan's political and cultural world. And of course, an entertaining show on how to make Michigan's political machine work for the people, and not just the elite few. Now, from the Left of Lansing headquarters from his mid-Michigan attic, it's time for the award-winning Pat Johnston. It's all yours, Pat.
Yeah! Welcome to another edition of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. I am Pat Johnston, and as of this recording, it appears, even though a majority of Americans don't want it, you're gonna get a war with Iran, and you're going to like it, America, because nothing says America first than fighting for another regime change war in the Middle East. And of course, this is waging a war that the ultra-right-wing Netanyahu government in Israel is demanding that we wage. Remember when dear leader Trump ran on being the anti-war president and how he was always going to be America first? Right. Do you recall the number of times members of the corporate media would lecture us in serious tones how this was the day that dear leader became presidential, or that was the day dear leader became presidential? And the corporate press has tried its damnedest to tell us that everything would be fine with this authoritarian, egotistical, sexual abusing madman at the helm again. But now we've got his ICE Gestapo beating up, abusing, and disappearing undocumented citizens, killing American citizens, as ICE turns American cities, well, cities where Democrats are the majority, of course, into reenactments of Nazi control during World War II. Papers, please. But that's freedom, so I'm told. However, we saw how the working class is fed up with America fighting overseas wars with our tax dollars while being told there's just not enough money for decent healthcare coverage for you, the rabble. It happened in Detroit this week when dear leader made a stop at the Detroit Auto Show and then also at a Ford plant. And while dear leader was walking around Ford's Dearborn truck plant, where he asked those around him if this is where they made trucks, a union worker shouted at dear leader how he is a pedophile protector. The union worker is 40-year-old TJ Sabula, and he shouted what millions and millions of working-class Americans know to be true. Dear leader Trump is a pedophile protector, as his Department of Justice continues to be in violation of a court order to release all investigative documents surrounding the dead child sex abuser and trafficker billionaire Jeffrey Epstein. Now, let me remind you of former MAGA Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene's interview with the New York Times a few weeks ago, just before she officially resigned from Congress. Now, I know, MTG, not a good person, has done many horrible things to inflict harm on millions of people, which includes fighting to get dear leader Trump elected. Now, though, she's against him, and she probably got out of Congress because whomever he backed in a primary against her would probably win, because it's a cult. So Marjorie Taylor Greene told the New York Times that dear leader called her office and shouted at her as she was fighting to release the Epstein files, and dear leader told her that his friends would get hurt because of her, and that would be their last phone call. His friends, meaning several billionaire buddies, the oligarch class, the untouchable class. Now, isn't it strange how we are attacking Venezuela, maybe Iran, and, of course, attacking American people on the streets while the Epstein files still have not been completely released? No, it's not really that strange when you think about it. So, that union worker, TJ Sabula, at that Dearborn truck plant, shouted the truth to dear leader's face. He is a pedophile protector. And what did dear leader Trump do in response? He did what every great president has done. He said F you to Sabula and then gave him the bird. Twice, I believe, right? Yeah, twice. Now, I'm waiting to be told how this was the day Trump became presidential. Of course, since corporations always bend the knee to authoritarians so that way they can keep their massive tax breaks and government contracts, Ford announced It was suspending the worker while investigating the incident. Investigating what incident? That a Ford worker shouted truth at a guy who's destroying this country and who called him out for protecting pedophiles because those pedophiles are his friends? Now, my good friends over at the Michigan progressive activist group called Distill Social had a spot-on social media post this week on Dear Leader's decision to flip off a Michigan union auto worker, and they said a union-backed auto worker heckled Donald Trump during his Dearborn visit. Trump flipped him off twice on camera. Now, the worker has been suspended while Ford Motor Company looks into it. Per United Auto Workers, free speech for presidents, punishment for workers, that's the story. Yeah, that is the story. I mean, it's strange how the free speech warriors on the MAGA side are nowhere to be found nowadays. Why aren't they out there supporting this guy's American right to free speech? He's a working class American. Where are they? Now, I hate to sound like Michael J. Fox from The American President, but isn't it our duty as citizens to question our leaders? To Ford Motor Company, though, I guess not. I guess they believe calling Dear Leader a pedophile protector is worse than, say, I don't know, Ford accepting hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate welfare for EV car plants and then reneging on the deal. And as for punishing the workers, well, I mean, that's what the Trump regime has been all about in both terms. Prices are still high, electricity rates are skyrocketing, wages are stagnant, the working class is getting squeezed, but that's fine to the regime. They're not in power to protect and fight on behalf of you, the working class. They're in power to please and pay off the billionaire donor class. That backed this regime's campaign twice. Meanwhile, working class Michiganders and others across the country are supporting JT Sabula. Apparently, 2 GoFundMe campaigns for Sabula have raised over $450,000. I think the American people, the working class in this country, are making their feelings known. Detroit Progressive Democratic Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib tweeted the following in support of Sabula, calling Dear Leader a pedophile protector, and she said, "He's right. The president is, in fact, protecting pedophiles." Now, I don't know about you, but I'm certain that Mitch Albom right now is writing up a column in the Detroit Free Press where he's hand-wringing over Dear Leader Trump's lack of decency and decorum. Because don't forget how Mitch was waving a fan over his face, shouting, "I do declare," after Congresswoman Tlaib used the F-bomb while saying Democrats would impeach Trump during his first term. You remember that, right? And Dear Leader said the following back in 2019 about Rashida when he responded to her statement. He said, "I think she dishonored herself and dishonored her family using language like that in front of her son and whoever else was there." Wow, and please don't forget how the corporate media acted all verklempt over Rashida using the F-bomb on our dear leader, our dear, dear, dear leader. But I'm sure what we saw in Detroit this week was just Trump being Trump. It's always the double standard, right? But here's another thing I thought of. You would think that a man of the people, an America First man, a working class hero like Donald Trump, a fighter for everybody out there who's been wronged, that he would help this union auto worker out and that he would personally call Ford to tell them, hey, forget about it. It's okay. This man's a worker. He's contributing to society. He's got a family. I don't care. I'm the president. I've heard worse. I mean, that's what a president would do. That's what a leader would do. But we don't have a president. We have a pedophile protector. And we have a petulant little bully child. Yet, maybe I don't know what we're complaining about here. I mean, we are getting a ballroom at the White House after all. Let them eat cake, right? Speaking of the untouchable oligarch class, the Devos family has used its wealth and political power to its benefit and to the benefit of their oligarch friends in Michigan. Joining me to talk more about the power of the Devos family within the Michigan business community and the Michigan Republican Party and, well, actually, the entire Michigan political scene will be Jeff Smith, who's the founder and director of Grand Rapids Institute for Information Democracy, or otherwise known as GRIID. Jeff will be joining us here right after this break to talk about battling Devos and also how we can best battle the Trump regime's ICE Gestapo. You're listening to LOL.
You're listening to Michigan's premier progressive podcast. It's Left of Lansing with Pat Johnston. Have you ever heard Pat's lectures on why desserts with fruit aren't really desserts? Or why the 70s produced the greatest movies of all time? I have. So be happy you're just hearing him rant about politics. If you'd like to contact Pat about politics or debate how cocoa is technically a fruit, send a message to leftoflansing@gmail.com. Here's Pat Johnston.
Well, about a lifetime ago, when your esteemed host just graduated from Central Michigan University, I began my news talk radio career at WION Radio in Ionia, Michigan. Now, I grew up in the Metro Detroit area in a place called Redford Township, just a few blocks away from the Jeffries Freeway. Then after high school, I lived for the next 7 or 8 years in Mount Pleasant at CMU, where I got my bachelor's and master's degrees. So by the time I landed this first radio job to be the small station's news director in Ionia, I have to tell you, it became one of the most important parts of my professional life for a couple of reasons. One is that while I was engaged in national politics and was always interested in news, I didn't completely understand the importance of statewide politics until I got that job. And at 24 years old, I really began following what was happening here in the state. I mean, I had knowledge of state officials and some statewide news, of course, but my eyes opened up to the fact that what happened in Lansing really affected us faster than what was happening in Washington, D.C. Well, of course, for the disastrous war on terror and Iraq War, notwithstanding, of course. But the other lessons that I learned was the power structure of West Michigan politics. And that's when I learned more about and heard more about the Devos family, Van Andel. I knew about Meyer grocery stores, but I didn't exactly know much about the Meyer family. And that's when I also learned not only how much wealth these West Michigan families accumulated, but how much political power they wielded over Michigan politics in Lansing, especially within the Republican Party. For those of you who've listened to this show here for the last couple of years, you know that I've done extensive reporting on Betsy DeVos and her family, but I still never had a full grasp on how these billionaire families in West Michigan had their teeth in just about everything political and economical here in the state. And that's why I'm glad to have this week's guest on the show, because they're doing the kind of citizen journalism to highlight the actions of these billionaire oligarch families in West Michigan, but also they like to highlight other corporate powers that are pulling the political levers in Lansing. Jeff Smith runs a site called GRIID, which stands for the Grand Rapids Institute for Information and Democracy. He is the founder and director of it. And I'm pleased to finally get a chance to speak with him here on this week's edition of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. So Jeff Smith, thanks so much for joining us here this week. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Well, what's GRIID all about, and how did you come up with the idea to create it?
GRIID was basically an outgrowth of work that I was doing in the late 90s at the Community Media Center here in Grand Rapids. And I used to do a public access TV show called Days of Our Lies. And so just sort of critiquing news and thinking more critically about news and other kinds of dynamics, GRIID was sort of born. So GRIID used to be a part of the Community Media Center, an entity where we taught media literacy and we're kind of the local media watchdog group. And then I went independent at the end of 2006 from that entity and spend less time doing sort of the kind of media literacy education, although there's still some of that, but mostly still doing watchdog media stuff, but also doing lots of indie journalism because, as you well know, I'm sure as your listeners well know, that there is not only a deep shortage of coverage of critical issues from the commercial media entities that exist in this state, but also they have a tremendous bias and obviously a financial stake in maintaining sort of the status quo on matters. So it just seemed to me it was time to do a little bit more of that investigating, and which is not that I hadn't been looking at the DeVos family before that, but that's sort of, I've been definitely methodically kind of monitoring their activity since maybe the early 2000s.
Jeff, did you feel, you've been doing this, as you said, for a number of years now, did you feel that your project was needed in today's news information or disinformation climate? Because did you feel somewhat let down, not just by obviously when people talk corporate media, I think, they talk about the networks and things like that. But did you feel let down by the local news coverage?
Absolutely, because that's who I primarily have monitored. I haven't done a lot of tracking of the national or media outlets just because there are already great groups like Fairness and Accuracy and Reporting who already do that kind of work. So I thought it was important to kind of focus on what happens in the greater Grand Rapids area in terms of news coverage and what stories are being covered or what stories are not being covered. And in many ways, besides critiquing sort of the coverage of commercial news media in West Michigan, like I said, I've been doing lots of indie news coverage, and particularly coverage around movement work in West Michigan, because I also do a project called the Grand Rapids People's History Project. In fact, in 2023, I published a book called A People's History of Grand Rapids, which essentially follows Howard Zinn's model, but on the local level.
I would have to say, and I think you'd agree with this here probably. I mean, it's one reason why I'm doing this podcast too. I worked in the news talk radio format, as you heard, I talked about my first job in Ionia, but I worked many years over in Saginaw. And when I first got there, let's say in 2007, there were maybe, 6 or 7 people who worked in the newsroom. And then by the time I was let go about 2 years ago, I would say that speaking about full-time workers, probably maybe just 3. So that's hard for anybody to have to cover a large area of the state with just 3 people. And I guess maybe this is why publications such as yourself and the things that you're doing there and trying to educate people and trying to make people aware of what's happening in your area, why we're going to see that pop up even more and more probably here in the future.
Most likely. That seems to be the case. And certainly, as you mentioned, the dwindling size of newsrooms, people in newsrooms changing, that's certainly one of the major consequences of the consolidation of media ownership into fewer and fewer entities, which have as their primary goal profits over actually informing the public about how they can actually take an active role in civics in this society. So,
right. Very, very true. Well, listen, before we talk about, this billionaire family oligarch structure in West Michigan that you've been highlighting here for quite some time, Jeff, I've been spending, obviously, this last week focusing on the Trump regime's ICE agency becoming, increasingly violent, obviously, against American citizens, while they've always been violent against undocumented citizens for much longer. And I know that you've been providing some local coverage on ICE activities in Michigan. And I read your piece in which you detailed some of the companies that are making some nice tax dollar cash by helping ICE detain people here in the state. I was wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit more in detail.
Sure. A lot of the companies that are sort of profiting aren't necessarily locally based, but obviously the largest ICE detention facility that's in Baldwin, Michigan, which is owned by the Geo Group. They have a subsidiary called BI Incorporated, which is a entity that began its history figuring out ways to kind of track and tag livestock. Not surprising that they shifted their focus from livestock to human beings. And so BI Incorporated has contracts all over the country at what are called ESOP offices, which is where immigrants who are already in the system have to check in with ICE. So ICE contracts with BI Incorporated, which is a subsidiary of Geo Group, to interview and monitor and maintain ICE awareness of what undocumented immigrants are doing. So they also sell and force people to buy wrist bracelets, ankle bracelets, or download an app so that ICE can track them 24/7. So they're making money off that. And then just recently, it was announced, I think within the last month, that they also got a multi-million-dollar contract with ICE to hire bounty hunters, not to apprehend people, but to find out their whereabouts and then share that information with ICE agents to make it easier for them to snatch up even more undocumented immigrants. So that's just kind of a bit of a window into the reality of what we're looking at. Like I mentioned to you earlier, I'm a volunteer organizer with GR Rapid Response to ICE, and we do accompaniment for immigrants to their appointments, particularly at that office. ICE apprehended 8 people back in June, and since then we've been offering this accompaniment, and not one person who's gone to their meeting has been taken. So for me, it's just, again, an important thing about just the importance of like having people on the ground doing that kind of work to minimize the harm that's being done to immigrants. And that's what, for us, at least, immigration solidarity looks like. I posted just this morning an article saying how we need to move from protesting ICE to resisting ICE. And holding signs somewhere is fine, but ICE doesn't really care about that. They only get upset or frustrated when people are actively trying to prevent them from doing the kidnapping of people.
Right. Good point. And that's why I like that article that you wrote in GRIID detailing how American citizens could be doing more to help undocumented people to fight back against ICE other than just protesting. Don't get me wrong. Protesting is good. Protesting is a way to take the narrative or to push the narrative. And it's actually having some success, as we're seeing from multiple polls. A plurality of Americans now believe that we should either cut back on ICE's funding or abolish ICE altogether. So yes, protesting does work and does have its place. However, you brought up a great point, though, is that there's more that we could be doing. What are some of your ideas?
I can only speak to exactly what we do in GRAP response to ICE, which is besides accompanying immigrants to their appointments, to court appointments that they have, we also do patrolling in several neighborhoods throughout the city on a daily basis. Instead of waiting to get calls, we have a hotline. So instead of just waiting to get calls from people who have spotted ICE or who have ICE knocking at their door, we do patrols in multiple neighborhoods on a daily basis as a way of trying to preempt that. And if we spot ICE, then we call the hotline so that people who have been trained through GRAP response to ICE can show up and directly intervene to prevent ICE from taking people. We do regular monitoring of the ICE. There's 3 ICE offices in Grand Rapids, and particularly the deployment office. We do regular monitoring every day again as well to monitor the amount of vehicles in the parking lot, when they come and go, plates, photos of agents, all those kinds of things, just so we can more effectively try to ID ICE agents and their vehicles when they're out and about in the community. We also do sanctuary work. So we have several churches who are now sanctuaries for undocumented immigrants. We have safe houses as another demonstration to try to push people away from just saying they're against ICE or, holding signs in front of their office, but to say like, okay, here's a way for institutions to actively support immigrants and practice immigrant solidarity. And then the last thing that we do primarily is we work directly with, in fact, everything we do is direct connection with the immigrant-led group called Movimiento Cosecha, which is a national movement, and they have a local chapter. They don't call them chapters, they call them circles, but in Grand Rapids. And we have been working for the past 12 months to try to get the city of Grand Rapids and the county of Kent to adopt, not to declare themselves sanctuary cities, but to adopt sanctuary policies, which would concretely reduce and eliminate, if you will, the city and county's collaboration or cooperation with ICE. So those for us is a way of resisting ICE. It's different than protesting because it takes an active role, and it also to kind of throw monkey wrenches into what ICE wants to do. But it also, we're taking our direction directly from the undocumented immigrant community, which again, that's what Movimiento Cosecha is.
Do you fear what could happen if you could get confronted by ICE? I mean, after what we're seeing, obviously, in Minneapolis, what we saw happen in Portland, what we're seeing happening across the country with some of this violence, does that strike any fear in you whatsoever?
Well, I mean, it certainly strikes some concern. Obviously, I don't want to go to jail or be killed or any of those kinds of things. But I've also spent a great deal of time in Central America and in the Chiapas, Mexico, and Zapatista communities doing accompaniment for people there who are being confronted by their own militaries and death squads, acting as kind of a nonviolent bodyguard is what we used to call ourselves, right? So I'm aware of the risk, and my feeling is that why should my life be any more valuable than folks whose lives are already deeply marginalized? So to me, again, that's another demonstration of solidarity, that we're not going to be intimidated or live in fear ourselves that something like as what happened to, Renee Good happened. Not that none of us want that to happen, but most of the deaths at the hands of ICE have been victims, who are undocumented immigrants. And I'm glad that there's all this attention around what happened to Renee, and that's motivated people. But I also think that people need to realize is that she is not the first person who's been shot and killed by ICE, and that this should amplify, this is the kind of fear and repression that ICE has been engaging in against undocumented immigrants since 2003 when they were created.
Do you think this kind of violence and intimidation is just going to get worse here in the near term before it gets any better?
It seems likely, just because ICE still hasn't fully implemented the $75 billion. I know the number is quite often put at 150, 170, but ICE particular has got $75 billion through the big, beautiful bill. So they haven't fully implemented. In fact, Grand Rapids is one of the 19 cities where a bunch of that money was coming to, because they wanted to open up a 4th office by renting a downtown office space, a space that we have yet to determine whether or not they have, or if it's up and running yet or not. So we assume they will, or if they haven't already, hired more agents. And that means the activity will most likely increase in terms of them apprehending and detaining people. So we anticipate it's going to get worse before it gets better, but we also think that this is an opportune time for people who want to get involved in the work to take a training, get involved with this work, and take an active way of actually resisting what ICE is trying to do, and at least in the Grand Rapids area.
Very good. Well, we just have a few minutes remaining here, Jeff. And another reason I brought you on was because, as I said, that you've been shining a light on the Devos family, some of the other billionaire oligarch families that are in West Michigan. And recently you brought up a great point. I think it was it was last year, because while a lot of us were concentrating on Elon Musk and Doge and, of course, Peter Thiel and some of the other billionaire tech bros, you wanted to point out that it is indeed important for us to also be aware that we've got similar billionaire oligarch families here in our state who are buying politicians, especially Republican politicians, and who have their teeth in Lansing politics and have for a very long time, and that we should be protesting them as well. So I'm just going to kind of give you the floor. Maybe you can give just kind of a broad tutorial, I guess, on exactly what kinds of families are we talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll focus specifically on the Devos family. I mean, there certainly are other entities, but the Devos one has had historically the most influence and continues to do that for a variety of reasons. I mean, it's somewhat befuddles me that when people were up in arms about the whole Project 2025, there was no conversation on the fact that the Devos family has historically funded. So if you look at the groups that were endorsing Project 2025, there's at least a dozen, if not more, for sure, that the Devos family has been funding for, in some cases, decades. So there's that sort of connection. Then there's the issue that you brought up about, in terms of financing candidates at the state level. I mean, at the federal level as well, at the state level, but then also financing candidates who are running for office at local level, many of them these are nonpartisan races, whether we're talking about city commission races or county races that are not commissioners, but like sheriff and all those kinds of things. So it's interesting that the sheriff of Kent County right now, Michelle La Joya Young, the largest contribution she got in the 2024 election was from the Devos family, the members of the family. In fact, about 3/4 of the money she raised for her campaign was directly from that family, because they want to make sure that whoever's going to be in that position is going to act in a way that's going to protect their interests, right? Protect the interests of the capitalist class, all those kinds of things. And that's instructive because the county sheriff, several of us, including myself, were arrested at the sheriff's office last Monday a week ago, because the sheriff's office through the Kent County Jail are engaging in holds for ICE, so that immigrants who are in jail for minor infractions who are ready to be bonded out are then not released because ICE wants them to take them to the Baldwin facility. So there's that component of it as well. And then the other thing I think it's really important for people to think about is that, so the Devos family, particularly the second generation and now the third generation increasingly. So everybody knows Rich Devos, he's sort of the Amway co-founder with Jay Van Andel. And yeah, there's a lot we could talk about just with him, but the current generation, so we're talking about Doug and Dan and Dick and Cheryl, who are the 4 children. And then that would also include Betsy, who's married to Dick, who's from the Prince family. All of these folks also have their own company. So they've extremely diversified their own wealth outside of Amway itself, right? Amway is now kind of, even though it's the most recognizable, but they've diversified their wealth in such a way that so they have their hands in a whole range of things. Dan DeVos owns more car dealerships in the Midwest than any other entity. Doug DeVos runs RDV Corp, which has a whole range of kinds of things, which includes owning pickleball courts throughout the state. Huh. Dick DeVos, he's now diversified to owning bourbon labels. And so there's all that kind of dynamic. And so we have no idea like how much maybe we're contributing to their wealth by purchasing things that they have control over. But then the other thing that I think, again, is the most important is that the diversification is that they themselves either sit on boards throughout the county in West Michigan, or a representative of theirs does, again, across the board, whether we're talking about university boards, whether we're talking about nonprofits in the community, whether we're talking about chambers of commerce or groups like West Michigan Policy Forum or Grand Action 2.0, whatever. All these things are essentially either creation or of the DeVos family, or have sort of dictated the tenure of those entities. And the interlocking systems of power is staggering. I do a workshop in the area called Grand Rapids Power Analysis, just to provide a critique, an investigation for people, like how deep all this stuff goes. And people are always like, I had no idea, right? And that's what they're banking on. They're banking on that we don't know, like in what ways they are connected to whatever it might be. And then the last component would just be all the family members have their own foundations. And of course, they fund all this stuff, right? So Of course, foundations are a way for rich people to hide their wealth because it's not taxed, but then they get to insert their power by giving out money to, again, make sure that entities that are getting the money will do what it is that they want them to do. So it's rather complicated and complex, but I think it's just really important for people to understand that that kind of influence is, at least in West Michigan, this is unprecedented. I mean, there's been no entity in the last half century that has had that kind of influence on political, economic, social, and even cultural dynamics within this area.
And they learned the lesson that all politics is local.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, I get why there's a lot of attention. And I know a lot of people, when Betsy DeVos became Secretary of Education, like, yeah, good. I'm glad that the light was being shined on them at some level. But it became clear to me, even though I was monitoring what she was doing and writing about that on a regular basis, that people were still not paying attention to what was happening in West Michigan. And, if people want to do a deep dive, I have about an 850-page document on the GRIID site. If you go to the document section, it's just called the DeVos Family Reader. And it's just pretty much everything I've been writing for the last 25 years about this family. It's not just like my opinion. It's based upon like how much their foundations are giving and who they're giving it to, what candidates they're backing, what groups they're a part of, and how they're influencing those dynamics in the city, whether it's development issues, whether it's, purchasing the rights, naming rights to the soccer stadium, to owning the soccer team that's going to be coming in a year or so. I mean, just all those kinds of things. It's just so much. And I think it's important for people who care about any kind of citizen engagement or civic engagement to understand the tremendous power that they have in this community.
I know this is just a touch off topic, but if I'm recalling, it was back in the 2000s when the Iraq War was happening, everything. It was Betsy DeVos's brother, right, who belonged, was that Blackwater? Was
Correct.
That what? Yeah.
Eric Prince, yeah.
Eric Prince, thank you. Yeah. I could not remember his name for some reason, but yeah. So I just wanted to quickly just cover, and thanks for giving us that broad overview exactly of what that family has been about and how they are somehow injecting themselves into our lives in so many different ways. Now, Jeff, if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind pivoting towards education, because there's one thing I have talked a lot about on this show when it comes to the DeVos family, Betsy DeVos particularly. It has to deal with their lifelong dream, their lifelong work to privatize Michigan's education system. Last month, I talked with a guest from the Invest in My Kids ballot proposal movement, and that proposal, if it does get on the 2026 ballot here in Michigan, would raise taxes on those making over $1 million here in Michigan to help fund our public schools, which for years were severely underfunded, and we're trying to play catch up now. And one easy way to play catch up is to pass this ballot initiative. However, you have written extensively in GRIID on the DeVos family and others who've been running a major disinformation campaign when it comes to Invest in My Kids. And I was wondering if you could talk more about this disinformation effort from DeVos and others.
Sure. And it'll be difficult to know until campaign financing stuff is made fully public, later this year about all that kind of stuff. But they certainly, again, their involvement in attacking this ballot initiative is, again, mostly coming through the entities that they are a part of, whether that's the State Chamber of Commerce, the Grand Rapids Chamber of Commerce, the West Michigan Policy Forum in particular. I mean, they hired as their kind of PR frontman Chase Bolger, the former state representative in Michigan, Republican state representative. West Michigan Policy Forum hired him to kind of be their front man a little over a year ago. And he does a weekly misinformation piece on the Invest in Kids, Michigan ballot initiative. So it's really through those entities that we're aware of, at least for right now, what's public, that's how they're using their influence, their money to back any entity that would, not surprising, oppose the slight increased taxing of people who are millionaires or billionaires like themselves.
And finally, what always amazes me, Jeff, is how these families, like the DeVos family, for instance, will lecture we, the working class, on hard work and having to pull ourselves up from our bootstraps. But then at the same time, there they are benefiting greatly from massive government contracts. Is it their belief that they think that we, the working class, are not aware of all of this truth?
I think that's what they're banking on. I think more people are becoming aware of those sort of dynamics. And I think so. There's a project that the DeVos Van Andel families jointly put forward in 2024 called the Three Towers Project. project, which basically is a massive, about a $750 million investment to build apartments, another hotel to add to their already 6 owned hotels in Grand Rapids, as condos, and then a few other potential businesses on a vacant parking lot that's downtown. But the thing that's interesting about it is that the local government, both the city of Grand Rapids, the Kent County government, and not too recently, the State Economic Development Corporation, gave them a $565 million tax break for this to 2 billionaire families who are collectively worth over $20 billion. So why the hell would you be giving that kind of money to a family, which for them to spend $765 million is a drop in the bucket, because they know they're going to make that back and more in the not too distant future because of housing costs, condos, hotels, all those kinds of things, because it fits into the development that's happening in Grand Rapids, because it's going to be right smack dab between the new 12,000 seat amphitheater that opens in the spring. And then on the other side of it will be the Amway soccer stadium, right? So all these things that, oh yeah, we'll stay at the hotel because, we're going to go to the game or we're going to go listen to a concert kind of thing. So there's no way that they're not going to make that back. To give them that much, or for any matter, even a penny of tax breaks makes no sense, while according to recent data, at least in Grand Rapids, 49% of people are living paycheck to paycheck. Makes no sense.
And it's also happening at the same time when state Republicans are fighting to block hundreds of millions of dollars in spending for working class initiatives and all that for families and everything.
Sure. Yeah. Definitely. But I'll say one thing about that is I think this is not just about the Republicans. To me, the Democrats are equally culpable because they do not talk about these issues. They do not expose the power and influence that this family has. I mean, not to say that none of them do, but not in West Michigan. Anybody who runs as a candidate, they don't want to go up against these people. And I think that is a huge mistake. It makes no sense why they would want to avoid that, because I don't know how you can avoid that if you don't have your head buried in the sand.
And thank you, Jeff, for bringing that up. I meant to ask you if the Democrats here in the state are putting a spotlight on the Devos family. I don't feel like they are as a party. Sure, like you mentioned, there are a few that will mention Devos, but at the same time, I really don't hear an effective messaging campaign that paints Betsy DeVos and the DeVos family like Democrats want to try to paint Elon Musk as nothing but greedy oligarch billionaires who don't mind a little authoritarianism happening as long as they continue to get rich at our expense.
No, I think they've done a pathetic job. We can speculate about the reasons why they haven't. I mean, I have my own thoughts about that, but I think a lot of that just has to do with the fact that they also don't want to piss off the capitalist class,
right?
Whoever it is, because they more often than not rely on them as well to get elected to main business as usual. So it's frustrating, but it's also not surprising in terms of how you look at partisan politics, at least not for me. I mean, I'm equally critical of Democrats as I am with Republicans, even when they have power, right? So
that's right.
When Democrats had the trifecta in Michigan, how did that actually benefit working class people? There are a few examples of things, but nothing substantive in the long run that people benefit from. So.
Right. And that's why I believe in 2026, we're going to see a bloody primary fight for some statewide races on the Democratic Party side. Also, I think across the country. But the demarcation line is becoming much more pronounced than I think it ever has been for Democrats, as you've got the pro-corporatist, or like you said, the capitalist class on one side, and then you've got working class candidates on the other side. So we'll have to see what happens there. Jeff Smith, founder and director of Grand Rapids Institute for Information Democracy, or GRIID. Thanks so much for being on this week. I've been wanting to get you on here for a little while, and you shared a wealth of information for those wanting to know more about what's happening on the west side of the state, especially when it comes to the DeVos family, and also all of your work when it comes to immigration and fighting back against what the Trump regime is doing. Everyone, please visit GRIID. I will provide links wherever you're listening to this podcast. Jeff has provided so many writings, like he said, decades of writing on the DeVos family and the rest of the power structure in West Michigan. He's also provided videos and much more there. So I'll put links to GRIID. Jeff, thanks so much for being on the show here this week. And of course, we'd love to have you on again soon.
Yeah, no, I'd love to be back on, and thank you for the opportunity.
bringing progressivism with passion each and every week. It's Left of Lansing with Pat Johnston. Follow us on Blue Sky, Twitter, Facebook, and the Gram. Subscribe to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts, and subscribe to us on YouTube. We'd also like to thank Audio Boom for publishing the show and helping us spread our populist, progressive, and patriotic message. Speaking of which, let's get back to the show with Pat.
Hey, thanks again to Jeff Smith of the GRIID for talking with us this week. Like I said, I'll provide links to GRIID so you can check it out and read many of Jeff's fantastic write-ups on the MAGA billionaire oligarchy in West Michigan. But as you heard Jeff say, there's plenty of blame to go around for why this oligarchy remains as powerful as it is, and that leads to this week's Left of Lansing Last Call. Near the end of my interview there with Jeff Smith from Grand Rapids Institute for Information Democracy, or GRIID, he mentioned an important reminder for all of us. That reminder is that while, yes, the MAGA billionaire Devos family has given local politicians and MAGA Republicans to serve their interest in Lansing, let's not forget how state Democrats haven't done the greatest of jobs in fighting back against the Devos oligarchy. Sure, a few state Democrats will say something or highlight the power the Devos family owns in the state, but it's not one of their central messaging planks on a daily or even weekly basis. And I've always gotten this feeling that the people who expose and who truly fight against this insidious and pro-corporate authoritarian class are grassroots progressives and everyday working class Michiganders. I brought up how Jeff Smith wrote extensive articles on how the Devos family is part of this major disinformation network against the Invest in My Kids ballot initiative. Now, this initiative, which is currently collecting signatures to get on the 2026 ballot, would levy a 5% surcharge tax on a single filing Michigander making over $500,000 and joint filers making over $1 million to help fund the state's public schools, which remained underfunded by around $4 to $5 billion. Remember, we never recovered from the years and years of disinvestment, thanks to Rick Snyder, who, by the way, the DeVos family loves. This tax would impact around 1.8% of Michiganders, just 1.8%, who could easily afford such a tax that would help educate our kids. And this initiative was never something that many Michigan Democrats in Lansing would ever dream of proposing. Some, yes, and some have voiced their support for the initiative. Most of them being strong progressive voices, of course, but not many, including Governor Whitmer, who could have used her bully pulpit to pass such a law when Democrats had the trifecta a few years ago. That's how you show support for the working class, by pushing forward and advocating for a populist agenda. Has Michigan Democratic nominee for governor, Jocelyn Benson, announced her support for this initiative? I don't know. I haven't seen anything. I understand that she's got her own funding plan, but this Invest in My Kids plan is pretty clear-cut. What about the Democratic Senate candidates? I know Progressive Abdul Saeed has endorsed Invest in My Kids, but I don't know if I've seen anything from State Senator Mallory McMorrow or corporate Democratic Congresswoman Haley Stevens on this issue. By staying silent and not joining up to push this Invest in My Kids ballot initiative, it's exactly how some of our leaders inside the Michigan Democratic Party establishment are essentially allowing the DeVos disinformation machine to face little opposition and basically help give them a win. Where's the fight? And if you believe former Detroit corporatist mayor Mike Duggan backs such a plan, then you'll be in for a rude awakening. Duggan won't dare ever cross corporate authoritarian titans such as the DeVos family. Never. And lastly, I have to mention the portion of my discussion with Jeff Smith on his activities to help protect the undocumented community in West Michigan, as we're seeing in Minneapolis, where the Trump regime's ICE Gestapo is causing chaos and violence in the streets. Those ordinary and everyday working class Americans are showing up, protesting, and fighting back to protect their neighbors, to protect their friends from fascism. protesting can work, and protesting can move the needle. But as Jeff said, protesting isn't enough, and there are many ways you can join in the fight to help protect undocumented citizens in your communities, like we're seeing in Minneapolis. And those people are standing their ground. Again, the National Democratic Party was caught flat-footed on this issue and didn't believe, for some reason, that Dear Leader and his regime would ever inflict such harm and such a white supremacist Gestapo on its own people. I mean, we knew they would do it because that was always Stephen Miller's dream, but for some reason, they didn't. It's why Congresswoman Haley Stevens, who wants to be Michigan's next senator, voted to thank ICE for its hard work last summer. For the first time, polls are now showing how Americans are feeling about the Trump regime's ICE Gestapo. A new Economist YouGov poll found that 46% of respondents support abolishing ICE altogether, with 43% opposed to getting rid of the agency. So the needle is moving, and it's proving that we progressives were always right on this issue. However, you have that pro-corporatist third way group. That's what they're called, third way. And that group has a lot of sway within corporate Democratic Party circles. And it's begging them not to advocate for the abolishing of ICE because they fear this will allow J.D. Vance to hit Democrats over the head on the issue. Meanwhile, ICE is literally hitting Americans on the head right now. But corporate third way types who push this milquetoast corporatist agenda are begging Democrats to look the other way, to not join in this fight, an American fight. An American first fight. And maybe it's because how many of those Democrats receive campaign cash from the private prison industry? Michigan Democratic Senator Alyssa Slotkin gave an impassioned speech this week as she announced that the Trump regime is investigating her for her role in that video with a handful of other Democratic senators who encouraged troops to defy the regime's illegal military orders. Due to that video, Dear Leader accused Slotkin and the senators of sedition. Yes, it's ridiculous, but now the regime's Department of Justice is going after them. Now, don't forget that Slotkin okayed many of Dear Leader's nominees at the beginning. Don't forget that Slotkin gave a thumbs up to the Lake and Riley Act, which basically served as a capitulation to what we're now seeing happening in Minneapolis and elsewhere. And don't forget that Slotkin backed a bill granting Dear Leader's family complete freedom to earn millions of dollars in cryptocurrency because she received backing from that same cryptocurrency lobby. And of course, Slotkin was the only Democrat in the Senate to vote for the regime's bill that nullified California's plans to ban gas-powered cars in 10 years. Who needs to breathe? Was it worth it not to stand up to authoritarianism from the very beginning, Alyssa? Was it? Was it worth it to capitulate like you did? Was it worth it? Remember, everyone, please remember who's pushing for real, populist, progressive, working-class change and those who are always there supporting the corporate authoritarian status quo. Remember that.
You're listening to Left of Lansing. Music for the show and everything else on Left of Lansing is provided by Wanderbeats. To hear the latest project and complete music archives, check out Space Leopard on your favorite streaming site or subscribe to Space Leopard on YouTube. Now, back to our favorite progressive voice in Michigan. It's Pat Johnston.
Well, that's going to do it for this edition of The Left of Lansing. Remember, you can always email me, leftoflansing@gmail.com. I always appreciate all your messages. And I just wanted to leave you with this little tidbit from Gallup. 54% of millennials and 56% of Gen Z are now calling themselves politically independent. Now, that's a higher percentage than recorded when my generation, Gen X, was asked the same question years and years ago when we were young. And it stands to reason, though, since Gen Z and millennials aren't real enthused about MAGA Republicans, obviously, but they're not happy with Democratic Party leadership, which is doing nothing nowadays but writing letters of concern. I saw a video of New York City's Democratic Socialist Mayor, Zoran Mamdani, getting loud cheers from striking nurses as he walked amongst them and showed his support for their strike. And that showed me how if you simply put forth a passionate, bold, and common sense populist progressive agenda, the people will support you even if they don't agree with every part of your agenda. They simply see someone who cares, who listens to them, who stands up for the working class, and who is fighting for the working class. That's an easy lesson to learn, everyone. Very easy. Stay warm, stay safe, but most of all, stay engaged and take the battle to them. Thank you, Michigan!
You've been listening to Left of Lansing with Pat Johnston. Left of Lansing was produced by Pat Johnston, brainstormed by Pat Johnston, researched by Pat Johnston, written by Pat Johnston, edited by Pat Johnston, and yes, hosted by Pat Johnston. Technical assistance by Dr. Heather. Thanks to our good friend Rich for website assistance, and thanks to our good friend Kirsten for the awesome podcast logo. We thank Audio Boom for publishing the podcast every week. Visit leftoflansing.com for more news and information. Thanks again for listening to Michigan's premier progressive podcast, and we'll talk with you again next week.